Hi, and welcome back to Rugged Mountain Homestead. My name is Sarah, and today is another busy day in the kitchen. We have picked up our beef share, and so we will be canning 10 pounds of ground beef today. I have plenty more to can. I think I have probably 25 more pounds waiting on me, some beef stew meat, and then the rest is in our freezer. So let's go ahead and get started on canning ground beef in the kitchen. Now let me just say before we get into all of it that everybody has their own way of canning. Some are strictly by the Ball Book of Preserving. Others are what you call rebel canners, and they just can everything. I am not a rebel canner, and I do have my guideline. We had to print this out on the computer, but this is the canner manual that came with my pressure canner. And I'm using these guidelines to can our ground beef today. Sometimes there's a lot of controversy around canning and the safety of canning. I am not interested in controversy. I do my reading and I do what I think is best for our family. And you need to do the same. That being said, when you pressure can anything, it takes it to such a high pressure and a high heat that botulism cannot grow in that environment. Mainly when you have those issues, it is with mistakes made during water bath canning. So now that I've said all that, let's get into canning our ground beef. Okay, now my first step in canning is to have all of my supplies out. I have this thing here is used to get out any pockets, and it's called a debubbler. It's really not a professional tool. This is an old Tupperware grapefruit peeler or something like that. You have your jar lifter, some white vinegar, a funnel, and paper towels. I also keep a couple pot holders handy, and then a couple towels that are less than stellar that I don't mind setting jars on, or if they get a little messy. Now I have put all my jars in the canner. The heat's kind of turned down to medium, just enough so that after you've washed all of your jars, it warms them up, and it's also a little bit of, I guess, a disinfecting process. And I almost forgot this little handy dandy tool. This is actually just a wand with a magnet in the end of it. And I also put my lids and rings into the canner, and I'll be using this to get them out. And then when I take these out and the jars, I'm going to set them on my towels. You want to be really careful doing this because the jars have hot water in them and you don't want to burn yourself. A steam burn is the worst kind of burn to have. Okay, now a little bit of unsolicited advice. On canning day, you're going to want to have something in your crock pot, Instant Pot, something like that, because even though you're only canning one batch, it does take a long time, and you don't want to be starting to cook dinner when you have a canner going on the stove. That's just a little bit of unsolicited advice on what I do. Okay, now in our bowl, we have 10 pounds of ground beef. And from previous experience, I know that I can get 1 pound of ground beef into a pint mason jar. So I'm going to grab one of my pints. They're getting a little bit easier to handle. And I'm just going to load the ground beef into the pint jar. Now, for those of you who are a bit squeamish about handling raw meat, I'm sorry, you may want to use some latex gloves, but this is not a problem for me. So I'm just going to go ahead and take some of the meat, drop it into the jar. You don't want it to be like packed solid because you want there to be some room for air. You are going to give it a 1-inch headspace, which means that you're only going to fill it up to this line right here. And you can push it down a little bit, but you just don't want it to be solidly packed because you're going to need some space for the fat that's going to occur, that's going to come out with cooking. And of course, you will have the ground beef shrink a little bit. Now, the difference from what I'm doing to what I've seen a lot of people do is that I don't cook my ground beef before I put it in here, because when it's in the pressure canner, it's cooking. And so I don't want to double cook it, and it's perfectly fine. Like I said before, the pressure canner gets up to temperature that botulism cannot survive in that environment. And of course, whenever you're handling meat, you want to be sure that you have washed your hands really well beforehand and after. Another thing that I wanted to state is that I am using the manual for my pressure canner for the directions for canning meat. However, I am using the cut up meat recipe. In their guidance, the ground meat is cooked first, and then the fat drained, and then put into the jars, and then basically it's cooked again in the pressure canner. So, cut up meat says strips, cubes, or chunks. Well, I kind of dropped the ground beef in there into chunks, and that gives it some room so that it is basically cooked in its fat. So I have my jars finished being packed here. I'm just going to move them all down here. I'm still going to use this tool here to get out any large air pockets. And then when I do use this canned ground beef, I do not take the fat off of it. It won't be a ton of fat, but there will be some. And the reason that I don't is because then if I'm using onions or peppers or anything like that, then it cooks in that fat that's left over from the meat. So I'm just going to push all around down here. As you can see, there's plenty of room. And as I do that, the 1-inch mark is where the meat is as well. And I actually used the raw pack method after seeing a lady who has about 25 years on me and a lot of canning experience, having been raised on a farm. And a lot of times that kind of experience, most times that kind of experience is extremely valuable. So you can see that when it's in the pressure canner, it has plenty of room for the fat to go. And it's going to shrink down just like ground beef does when you cook it. It's going to shrink down a bit too. Now it is by my choosing that I'm also going to use a teaspoon of salt in each of my jars. Okay, now that I have my salt in there, before I put lids and rings on, I'm going to clean each of the tops of these jars, the rim and around the edge, with vinegar. That way I know that there is not any bit of fat on there. Sometimes you can't even see it. And if you have fat or anything, a small piece of meat, you will not get your seal, and what a waste that would be. And then I'm going to fold it back and use a different part of the paper towel so that I'm not wiping anything that I got off of this jar onto another jar. And I have several paper towels over here because I only use one of these half sheets for 2 jars. See that tiny bit there? Right there. That would keep your jar from sealing. Okay, now that I have my ground beef in the jars, a teaspoon of salt in each pint jar, and they've all been wiped down with vinegar, I'm going to go ahead and put my rings on. So I have a ring, and I'm just going to drop the heated lid down inside the ring and just do it finger tight. Now, for the longest time I was like, finger tight, what is it? It made no sense to me when I first started canning what finger tight was. What it is that I just put it on to the tightness of only my fingers. You're not putting your wrist into it. This is a wide mouth jar. Okay, now it's time to fill up our canner. My size canner, you can have 10 pint jars on the bottom and 10 on the top, but they all have to be the same type mouth. Mine are not. I didn't worry about it. So I have a couple wide mouth in there, so it's just going to be 7 on the bottom, and I'll just put 3 on top. Okay, the canner lid is on nice and tight. I'm going to turn the stove up to high, and when the canner starts venting steam for 10 minutes, then I will put on the weight. One thing that is non-negotiable is the amount of time that you use for your product, whatever you're canning. For pint jars containing meat, whether it's cubed, ground, strips, or anything like that, it's 75 minutes for pint jars, 90 minutes for quart jars. So that 75 minutes does not start until your canner has not only vented steam for 10 minutes, you've dropped the weight on, and it gets up to the pressure for your altitude. Then you start the timer. Because we live at 6,600 feet in altitude, I need to can with 15 pounds of pressure. But for most people at low altitude, they only need 10, but it is 15 here. Okay, so while I'm waiting for the canner to come up to steam for 10 minutes, I'm gonna go ahead and take a small break at the table, still where I can see the canner, and have a coffee. And I'll catch you back in just a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to start the 10 minutes for venting steam now. And even though it's been venting a little bit, I never consider it venting steam until this little pressure regulator, it has popped up. Once it's popped up, I know there's steam coming out. That's the only place for it to escape. If you wanted to, you could always put a jar over just to see. But now I will go ahead and set my timer for 10 minutes. Okay, so my timer has gone off. I know that the pot has been steaming for 10 minutes now. Now I'm going to take my weighted gauge that's weighted with 15 pounds and I'm going to place it on that vent pipe, and then I'm going to wait until it comes to the amount of pressure that I need for my altitude, which is 15 pounds. Okay, now is not the time to leave your canner at all. You're going to want to keep your eye on this because you want to make sure that it reaches the exact amount of pressure that you need. Once it has reached the 15 pounds of pressure, we will start the timer for 75 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes. Okay, we can now see that we have reached 15 pounds of pressure and our weighted gauge is doing its little dance. Now that we are at the pressure that we want, we can now set the timer for 75 minutes since we are processing pint jars. You definitely don't want to leave your canner at this point. You're going to stay close by because if your canner were to fall below the required amount of pressure for your altitude, you have to start all over again. So make sure you keep an eye on it. Okay, so our hour and 15 minutes are up. I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat completely off. I'm going to let the canner come down to zero, to no pressure on its own, and then I will also wait until this little plug over here drops as well. That will let me know there's no pressure built up in the canner. Once that happens, I will remove the weight. Okay, so now that the pressure valve is completely flush with the lid, then we know it's in. We also see that the pressure gauge is down to zero. We know it's okay to go ahead and take off the weighted gauge. I'm going to go ahead and let that sit for a few minutes just so it can kind of slowly release out some of the hot air, and then I will go ahead and crack the lid for about 5 minutes. Once that is done, I will come in here and lift the lid and we can take our finished product out of the canner. And well, friends, there you have it. 10 pint jars of canned ground beef. It is going to make for a great convenience and shelf-stable item. Now when I want to make a dinner with ground beef, all I have to do is heat it through. So thank you for joining me in the kitchen today at Rugged Mountain Homestead. We're always so glad when you do. I look forward to seeing you next time, and until then, take care.